Identity theft has become one of the most rapid crimes sweeping across our country, and perhaps in other countries as well. And it is occurring at unprecedented levels. Criminals are finding very creative ways to rip Social Security numbers and personal information from people, and then to go on to use that information in ways that are very harmful to the one that they rob, so to speak, and very beneficial to themselves. I'm quite confident that there are people here this morning in our audience that has happened to. And in the type of economy in which we live, it can be very difficult. You know, our economy or our banking system is designed in such a way that if credit bureaus and banks and financial institutions and such like, if they find some information about you that is not very pleasant in their eyes, so to speak, then your life is going to be very hard. So this is something that is occurring quite a lot in our country. I was reading just the other day about a lady whose purse was stolen, and over a period of time, those that did so and assumed her identity, they purchased 3 automobiles before she ever knew that any of this had occurred. And the only way that she knew that it occurred is that one of the dealerships sent her a thank you card for purchasing an automobile at their particular dealership. And so this is something that goes on, as I mentioned, quite a bit. But there are some people who have the nerve to steal the identity of God, which is much more serious in my mind. You might ask the question, who would be willing to do such a thing? You can't imagine a person doing such a thing, and perhaps a lot of people do not do so intentionally. There are some that do, of course. Yet across this country, even this morning, there are those who misrepresent God's identity. In many pulpits and in many classrooms this very day, there are people who are guilty of stealing God's identity and misrepresenting Him as the God that we read of in our Bibles. There are those who have stolen His identity and replaced it with a God who seems to be concerned with this life only, or primarily with this life only. They say that His main concern is what goes on here and now, as opposed to this vast eternity that awaits each and every one of us. Those people, I suggest to you, have stolen God's identity. There are those who have stolen His identity and replaced it with a universalism God. They say that everybody is going to be eventually saved, and all roads that people take today, or all paths that they choose, is going to lead to heaven. Once again, I suggest to you this morning that those people have stolen the identity of God. There are those who have stolen His identity and replaced it with a sort of fast food God, if you will. Have it your own way type of relationship. Attempting to redefine sin as a lifestyle and elevating the expense, that is, elevating love at the expense of holiness. Once again, I suggest to you that they have stolen the identity of God. There are those that have stolen the identity of God and replaced it with a limited God. They insist that evil is in the world, and they recognize such, but they don't think God really has the power or capability of doing anything about it. That is called open theism. Here again, they have stolen the identity of God. There are those, once again, that have stolen the identity of God and replaced it with a political God. They try to make God some type of politician, as though He's running for some type of office, elevating social issues above everything else. And we see this oftentimes in some of the so-called crusades that go on in our country. Some of the things that people will advance in reference to their cause. They go to Washington in large crowds, or they walk the streets of some city, and it seems like, and they do it in the name of religion. They do it because they think that's what God wants of them, and they have replaced God, in my mind, with something foreign to what God really wants and cares about in regard to His people. There are those that have stolen the identity of God with a legalistic type of God. They try to make a list of do's and don'ts, and you say to yourself, if I keep the list, then I'm good. If I don't keep the list, then I'm not good. Here again, that's not the identity of God that we see in our Bibles. They have stolen God's identity in a number of other ways that we don't have time to talk about this morning or to mention. But for just a few minutes this morning, I want us to recover who God really is from the Scriptures. But the struggle with stealing God's identity as we talk about other people is that if the truth were told, I think each and every one of us, or most of us, want a God, because we tend to be very selfish individuals. We want a God who serves us rather than a God that we serve. We want to create a designer God, if you will, who has all the parts that we like, and we tend to delete all the parts that we don't like. And that's one of the biggest problems that people have when it comes to Bible study today. They do so with a frame of mind that what's in it for me? I'm going to discard these parts of God that I don't like. I'm going to accept the things that I do like. It's a terrible way to approach God's Word, and you'll never arrive at the reality or the truth of God's Word by doing so. So as we say oftentimes, we have to get our minds right when we approach God's Word. So today, this morning, based upon, hopefully, the truth of God's Word, I want to talk about the true identity of God. And to find out the true identity of God is something that we have to start with in regard to the original, if you will. In Exodus, the 34th chapter, verses 6 through 7, God fills out His own certificate as to who He is. And He describes to us who He really is. And it's this self-description that we see here that is referenced time and again for the rest of the Bible, or for the rest of Scripture. And this is the identity that ought to shape our teaching. Our teaching is not to be shaped by what's in style or what draws a crowd, but rather by the true identity of God. So listen to the words found in Exodus 34, verses 6 through 7 at this time. We'll take time to read this, and I think there are other passages that we might take time to consider. I don't know if we have enough time this morning. I'd like to keep things kind of short, if you will, but in this particular passage, Exodus 34, verses 6 and 7, we'll start here, and I think this is a very appropriate place to start, if you will. Beginning at verse 6, the Lord passed before him and proclaimed, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression of sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and on the children's children to the third and fourth generation. Here we have in this particular passage the true identity of God. A little bit later, or prior to this, in Exodus the 33rd chapter, verse 18, Moses made a request of God to show him His glory. And God replied to him that no one could see him and live. But He did go on to tell him to put himself in the cleft of a rock, and He said that He would pass by and cover him as He did so, showing Moses His back. And I believe that Exodus 34, the passage that we read earlier, is just a continuation of that particular event as God continued to show Moses Himself. And in the opening verses, the Lord tells Moses to chisel out two stone tablets a second time. Moses is up on his way to Mount Sinai, and as he's going up, the Lord came down in a cloud and stood there and proclaimed His true identity to Moses. And He starts, as we read a moment ago, the Lord, or Yahweh, Yahweh, El. But God begins by reciting His own name twice, followed by El, which is the biblical designation of deity. And this is the only place in the Bible where this repetition is found. But it serves two purposes, I think. It causes us to pause and take notice as He announces His name twice, And this was to emphasize his name and remind us of his name, which he stated earlier to Moses, I am that I am. We find a couple of other times where Jesus spoke the name of a person twice. In Luke the 10th chapter, he referred to Martha. He says, Martha, Martha. And on one occasion, when Peter was trying to oppose God's will and the plan that God had in store for Jesus Christ, his son, Jesus said to Peter, he said, Simon, Simon. It connects us, secondly, back to the first description of his name, which he gave Moses in the 3rd chapter, verses 13 following. You remember when Moses went up to the mountain and he stood before the burning bush and God was giving him instructions about how he would lead his people out of Egyptian bondage? At that particular time, he told Moses, or Moses asked the question, if the people ask, who you are and who I'm serving, if you will, what purpose, this purpose that you're giving me, who am I going to tell them gave me this purpose, gave me this role, gave me this job, if you will? He said to tell them, I am that I am. So he restates his name that he had given to Moses already, if you will, at that point in time. But he doesn't stop there. He then begins to unpack what he means when he says, I am that I am. And the first thing that God says, I am, is a compassionate and gracious God. He tells Moses that in the passage that we read earlier. He is compassionate in that he loves and cares for us as a mother would love her children. The word for compassion sometimes goes all the way back to the womb. Now, there are a lot of different Hebrew words and Greek words for the word compassion. But sometimes it goes all the way back to the womb, if you will, referring to the maternal nature of mothers. And I think it can be broadened to include the care of fathers and mothers, but foundational, we have the image of a mother caring for her children. God grabs hold of an image as a mother, as she cradles her children, as she nurses her children, as she teaches her children, holds her children, puts her children to bed, tends to them when they're sick. And he says, that's who I am. I am compassionate. I care, and I am concerned about you. I am concerned about my creation. So this lovingly describes God for us in this passage. His grace comes to those who are weak, you and I. God innately cares and is concerned for His creation, those that are weak, though we are undeserving of such care, as the Bible clearly states. He is the strong coming to the aid of the weaker. And it's by His own doing because of who He is. He cares. He is compassionate. He is involved in the lives of His creation. And here again, although we do not deserve such, He continues to do so. And He does this by His gracious actions toward us, which are many. We need to understand compassion and grace are not what God does necessarily, but what God is. And He does those things because of who He is. The word gracious is used 13 times in the Old Testament. Now get this, it's found 11 times in this section of Scripture that we have looked at this morning. So God cares for us, and He has no ulterior motives in doing so. And we can never repay Him for what He has done for us. That's just who God is. Also, God describes Himself not only as this gracious and compassionate God, but I'm sure in doing so, when he describes himself as such, that Moses probably began to think about all the occasions when God was concerned about not only himself, but for his people as well, and how he intervened in certain situations with Moses and his people. Look at Israel's story, if you will. The oppression of the Egyptians for some 430 years. We read of that in Exodus 1. Then Exodus 2, we see God answers the prayers of His people. He hears the groanings of His people. He looked at them and was concerned about them. God cared enough to hear their prayers and then graciously get involved and rescue them. And if that were not enough, as I mentioned earlier, Moses probably thought about himself, his own story, if you will. In Exodus 1, he was scheduled to die with all the Hebrew boys were to be killed as babies. But in Exodus 2, God cared enough to get involved and kept him alive so that the basket in which he was placed could float to the right house at the right time, in the right stream, to the right woman. So God cares, and he cares graciously and goes beyond all expectations. And when God puts graciousness and compassion together, he does so in such a fashion, once again, where he knows that we cannot repay him for it. Satan causes us oftentimes to question God's care. You know, when we see things that are just mind-boggling to us, we begin to question whether God really does care. Where is God at this moment? When you leave the hospital, for instance, after visiting someone who is on life support, we ask, does God care? When we watch some faithful member of the church suffering some kind of physical, debilitating something in their lives, we ask, where is God? Does he care? When cancer strikes someone that we love, when drug abuse hits close to home, when divorce visits those whom that we've invested in, when those who have been that have been faithful members of the church, builders of the church, enter hospice care, once again we ask, where is God? Does he really care? When we don't want to share with others because of a broken heart that we have, where is God? Does he care? We need to remember the identity of God. He does care. In 1904, in Leicestershire, New York, there was a fellow by the name of W. Stillman Martin. He was a well-known Baptist preacher who was invited to preach at a church some distance from where he resided. And that Sunday morning, his wife, Mrs. Martin, fell suddenly ill, and she was confined to her bed. And it made it really impossible for her to accompany her husband in his preaching engagement. Well, Mr. Martin seriously considered just calling off his speaking assignment because he would have to be away for a while, and so he was concerned about his wife, and he thought about just counseling. They had a young son who spoke to his father, and he says, "Father," he says, "don't you think that if God wants you to preach today, that he will take care of Mother while you're away?" So Mr. Martin agreed to that, and he kept his engagement. Returning sometime later, he found his wife greatly improved in health. In fact, while he was gone, she had been engaging in preparing a new hymn text, inspired by what their son had said, a chance remark by their son earlier on that particular occasion. And that same evening, Stillman Martin composed the music for his wife's words, if you will, just as they are sung today. "Be not dismayed, whate'er betide, God will take care of you." We sing this sometimes. We have, perhaps, in times past. God will take care of you. "Beneath his wings of love abide, God will take care of you. God will take care of you through every day, over all the way, he will take care of you. God will take care of you." A year later, as the story goes, this same lady, Mrs. Martin, also wrote "His Eyes on the Sparrow," another song that we sing sometimes. The second thing that God lays out for Moses, if you will, about his identity, excuse me, he says, "I am a loving and faithful God," very closely related about his compassion as well. And he draws on the covenant language that is found in the Old Testament and uses the Hebrew word hesed, which means unfailing love or loyal love. And this refers specifically to the commitment that God has made to his people in a covenant. Here, God's covenant is connected with the Hebrew word for faithfulness, emet, which also means truth or truthfulness. God's covenant means God is consistent with his character. He had a covenant with Israel, and God was bound by his covenant, and he fulfilled his covenant. He is a God who loves us with a love that never fails. He is a God who loves us with a commitment to His Word. He is a God who loves us and is faithful beyond comprehension. He has a loyal love that is forever committed and forever unfailing. Isn't it interesting that God describes this love on the heels of another episode of Israel's betrayal and disobedience? He gives this definition about His unfailing love, His loyal love, if you will, only after Israel had seen evidence of who God is or was. They have betrayed God in Exodus 32 by creating an idol, a golden calf, simply because Moses was taking too long as he went up to the mountain to receive the commandments of God. And because of their impatience and inability to be faithful to God in their leader's absence, God gives Moses a fresh understanding that he remains faithful to His Word. Moses also had dealt with unfaithfulness. In his hands at that moment, he had Scripture written on 2 tablets of stone. But the reason he was carrying those 2 tablets of stone that we mentioned in our opening reading is because he had broken the first pair due to the unfaithfulness of the Israelites. So Moses needed to know about the faithfulness of God. Moses needed to know that He was a God of faithfulness that he was serving. Moses heard loving and faithful, and that was music to his ears. It was though everything Moses had imagined he found in this God that he served. God also described Himself that Moses' only response when he had finished this definition was to bow down and worship. And all he could do was to worship and ask for God's presence. We need to know that God's love is indeed loyal, that it is indeed faithful. And His love and His faithfulness, they sustain us in our lives. And we need that as people. We live in days of just all sorts of things going on. Those of us who are older, 60, 70, so forth, we've seen drastic changes in our country. We see things going on today that were totally unheard of when we were younger, that was so shameful and so disgusting that these things were spoken in a whisper. But today, and this is tragic to young people, they grow up, as it were, with these things all about them, and they cannot see the difference that the older people see. And a lot of times they get caught in these traps. They fall into these same vices, if you will, all these same things that go on, which are wicked indeed, because they don't see this drastic difference, this big change that older people tend to see. We live in days of cohabitation, which is just rampant in our country. We live in the days of prenuptial agreements, days of fine print, if you will, days of free church agency. And what I mean by that is people change churches almost as often as they change their clothes. Everybody is looking for some better team, if you will. We live in the days of rising divorce rates. Been this way for a number of years now. We live in the days of a lack of commitment and loyalty to anyone or anything. Businesses fail, marriages fail, families fall apart, and we could just go on and on with this. We're so accustomed to unfaithfulness that God defines Himself by saying, I am faithful. Just a few passages that support what we've already stated. Joshua 1 and verse 5, I will never leave you or forsake you. This is repeated in Hebrews the 13th chapter. His compassions fail not. They are new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness. Lamentations 3, beginning at verse 22. God, who has called you into fellowship with His Son, Jesus Christ our Lord, is faithful. 1 Corinthians 1. No temptation has seized you except what is common to man. Our God is faithful. He will not let you to be tempted beyond that you are able to bear. But when you are tempted, He will also provide a way out so you can stand up under it. 1 Corinthians 10. The one who calls you is faithful, and He will do it. 1 Thessalonians 5. If we confess our sins, He is faithful and just and will forgive us our sins and purify us from all unrighteousness, 1 John 1. People need something that they can depend on, given all the fluctuations of life. It's something we can hang our hat on, if you will. Politicians come and go, city officials come and go, jobs come and go, health comes and goes, relationships come and go, friends come and go, preachers come and go. However, God comes along and tells us that He's here to stay. Dependability and reliability, consistency, integrity, faithfulness, all those things are found in the God that we serve. He is the consistency that people need in their lives. He will last. He will last through health problems that we all experience. If you haven't, you will. He will last through family problems. Many of us have those. He'll last through legal problems, job problems, money problems. He'll last through a recession. He'll last no matter how or who's in office, maybe I should say, put it that way. Doesn't matter who is leading our country, who is leading our state, who is leading our cities. He will last through it all. He will last. That's the message that He gives to Moses. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning. Through Him all things were made. Without Him nothing was made that has been made. 1 John 1. The grass withers and the flowers fall, but the word of our God stands forever. Isaiah 40. Lord, Thou hast been our dwelling place in all generations before the mountains were born, or Thou didst give birth to the earth and the world, even from everlasting to everlasting, Thou art God. Psalms 90. From the rising of the sun to the place where it sets, the name of the Lord is to be praised. Psalms 113. Jesus Christ, the same yesterday, today, and forever. Hebrews 13 and verse 8. So God will last. He lasted through 430 years of bondage of the Israelites. He lasted through the parting of the Red Sea. He lasted through the desert wanderings. He lasted through the stormy seas. He lasted through imprisonments. He lasted through floods. God indeed will last. And then the next thing that we find about the identity of God, and all these things are very closely related, He says that I am a forgiving and just God. The passage that we read earlier, forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin, yet He does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for their sins to the third and fourth generation. The word forgive comes from a Hebrew word which means to lift up, to take away. Israel needed a forgiving God. We need a forgiving God because they had the tendency to complain. We have the tendency to complain. They grumbled. We grumble. They doubt God. We doubt God. Most recently, as I mentioned earlier, they had created a golden calf to worship. And although God had proven Himself on timeless occasions, they still had a tendency to sin and were guilty in every way. And when you examine the track record of the Israelites, we could conclude that they needed a forgiving God. But as I said earlier, we don't have to look at them. We are the same. They did these things. We do these things. We can look at our own lives. We can look at our thoughts and our actions and our ways and our habits and our struggles and our weaknesses, our pride, our lies, our lust and our attitude. And we don't have to look back to the Israelites. All we have to do is look at ourselves. And we can conclude that we need the forgiveness of God. I can look at myself on my best days, and I'm so very far away from God's standard. Thank God that He is a forgiving God. He is lifting up people. He has lifted up. He is lifting, and He will continue to lift people's sins away. Moses knew about God's forgiveness because of his own struggles. Moses needed forgiving because of what he had done. He was a murderer on one occasion. God was forgiving before the law was given. God was forgiving in the Garden of Eden. God was forgiving, He is forgiving, and God will be forgiving. As far as the east is from the west, so far has He removed our transgressions from us. Psalms 103 verse 12. If we confess our sins, He is faithful and just to forgive us of our sins and all unrighteousness. Even I, He who blots out your transgressions for my sake, I will not remember your sins. Put me in remembrance. Let us contend together. State your case that you may be acquitted. Isaiah 43. So the text reveals that His nature is to forgive. But it also, as we read earlier in that passage, it also teaches that He will punish. Along with His forgiveness is His justice. And a lot of times people tend to leave this part off, and naturally so, because we don't like to think about justice. We don't like to think about punishment, recompense, if you will, for evil deeds. His forgiveness does not excuse His justice or His judgment. The text tells us, yes, He is slow to anger. He is patient with us. He gives us time to turn around. He gives us time to get it right. My dad used to tell me when I was a kid, he said, boy, I'm going to give you one more time. Now, I don't want to have to repeat myself anymore. Now, if I have to come back, I'm going to come back with my belt. And my dad was not, he didn't have a lot of control when it came to swinging a belt. The text also reveals that if we do not repent, God will not leave the guilty unpunished. It almost sounds that there's some kind of contradiction between the verses that we looked at earlier, or some of those verses where it talks about God's compassion and His forgiveness and so forth, with God punishing people. But the link is that forgiveness occurs for those who repent, while punishment remains for those who do not. So we have this perfect balance with God. God extends forgiveness and punishment. The unrepentant face the greatest consequences because they rejected God, who is gracious and loving. And after going through an episode of identity theft, about a person I read about in preparation for this lesson, this fellow saw an advertisement and decided to subscribe to a service called LifeLock. LifeLock is a service that promises to secure your identity and prevent anything going on your credit without proper authorization. And after this fellow enrolled in this program, every time his wife or he attempted to open a new line of credit, immediately his mobile phone would ring, and a representative from LifeLock would call him to ensure it was really him, or it was really his wife that were making some purchase or something going on with their credit. And only when he authorized the transaction would LifeLock allow that transaction to go through. His identity first had to be verified. He asked, can I send somebody? Can I mail it in? Can my wife come? Can I go online and complete a form? And they would say no to all the above. He had to show up in person. So he would gather a birth certificate, a Social Security card, his credit report, and so forth, and he would head somewhere and to take care of some matter that had been somewhat curious about. And he would do all these things to reclaim his identity if indeed his identity had been compromised. Well, 2,000 years ago, after the identity of God had been stolen on one of many occasions, God decided to reclaim His identity. He decided enough was enough, and He made His way to reclaim His identity. He couldn't send someone. It had to be Him. A prophet couldn't do it. A priest couldn't do it. An earthly king couldn't do it. An angel couldn't do it. So He decided to come Himself in human flesh to reclaim His identity. Jesus Christ was born in the town of Bethlehem, born to a virgin named Mary. He started His ministry around the age of 30. He was full of compassion, full of grace, and full of love. What does Jesus show us about the identity of God? Some of the things that we've already stated, I'll repeat them briefly, and the lesson is yours. He was compassionate. He was gracious. He was loving, faithful, patient, forgiving, and just. He was put through a fixed trial, wrongly convicted, carried his own cross, made his way up to a hill called Calvary. His hands were nailed, his feet were pierced. He wore a crown of thorns on his head. His side was pierced. He hung on a cross in the 6th to the 9th hour. He hung his head and he died. He was placed in a borrowed tomb. He stayed there for 3 days, and then Sunday morning he got up. Let's be thankful to God that He has reclaimed His identity. And I hope that each and every one of us will carry those thoughts that we presented this morning with us so that we can have a greater appreciation for the God that we serve. If there's anyone here this morning that needs to respond to the gospel invitation of Christ and you're subject to it in any sort of way, we ask you to come at this time while together we stand and sing.